I want to come clean here because I'm going through something myself right now.
The
So,
thing that people are moved by is the normalization that happens when you
mm,
hear somebody saying the thing out loud that you have thought a million times in your head but haven't ever heard another human being express. And like talking about life and death and how do we live knowing that we will die and how do we honor the people who came before us. And like put another canapé in my mouth. um,
silence.
Silence, chewing, quiet chewing, awkward eye contact. And then the person walks. Let's not quickly laminate over the thing that just happened and pretend like everything's fine and pretend like we can just go back to work and like it's okay. Because if you skate over that, you miss the moment that's the lock-in of like, oh, okay, got it. This is temporary. This is precious. This is finite. This is fucking heartbreaking, but it's also beautiful. And like, what am I going to do with my precious life?
To speak like a boss, let's get into your most powerful story. Because your story matters.
Carla Fernandez, everybody. Do your hand clap, please. Carla Fernandez. And Carla has written a book called Renegade Grief. Just flash us with your book. Excellent.
Here you
Please.
go.
Just flash us, okay?
Well, this is the only thing I'll flash you with on this interview, but I will flash it for you.
Thank you for flashing me. Carla, before we even get into an introduction of who you are, I think a really beautiful place to begin, because we are talking about grief today and what renegade grief looks like, right? How do
Yeah.
we make grief our own and how do we navigate it in 2025 and beyond? Tell me something beautiful about your dad or
Mm,
anything about your dad.
Thank you, Mahahodi. My dad's name was Jose Fernandez, and one thing that he did really beautifully was play the piano. He It was like the thing he did to relieve stress, the place he went when he needed to kind of just like unwind at the end of the day. And I have all these really beautiful memories of falling asleep growing up with him playing music in the next room on his piano. And it's like one of the soundtracks to my youth. And a sound that I miss hearing now, obviously, he died of brain cancer in 2010, but it's sort of the feeling of listening to him playing music is a place that I can still access within myself, despite the fact that it's been like 15 years since I've literally heard him play.
Yeah. And speaking of youth, I think that's one of the seminal pieces of this book, particularly, right? You were very young when you lost your dad. How old were you? Where were you? And what did being shocked by grief at such a tender age,
Mm.
in that particular moment, what did it mean?
Mm. Well, I was 21 when he died. I was 20 when he was diagnosed. And it was interesting because the way that you and I know one another is we were at NYU at a program at the same time that was all about social entrepreneurship and this idea that there are organizations that we can build or businesses that we can create or designs that we can manifest into the world that can right some of the wrongs that we're all facing
Very
and it's
ambitious.
very ambitious. And I was in this program alongside you, kind of trying to find my focus area, like what might be the issue area that I really want to sink my teeth into and apply my training against. And when my dad was diagnosed, I didn't immediately imagine that the work, the assignment that I'd be given by the universe, it felt like at the time would be apply these kinds of principles of creative problem solving to the ecosystem that is surrounding people who are experiencing the end of life or experiencing recent grief. And when I was 21 and he died, I was the first person in my friend group to experience the death of a parent. I'd kind of been through major life milestones with my friends up until that point around the same time, but it would be many years later until another close friend of mine had a parent die, which I now recognize speaks to the privilege of the place where I'm from, that there was like a lack of violence and, somewhat guaranteed safety, and that most people were dying at a normal age, and yet that was the world that I was living in. And yeah, I found both being with someone as he was dying like a wildly eye-opening experience about the nature of reality, about what matters the most. It felt like this big rite of passage that I had been through to get to like peek behind the curtain with someone as they were dying, someone who I knew very well and loved a lot. But that realization felt like in conflict with the ways in which the culture that I was living in at the time, which was California and New York, sort of felt ill-equipped to go there with me or to talk about death and grief and loss. And I realized quickly how well trained people were to avoid conversations about it. And it quickly became clear to me that if I was going to create the space where I could really dive into these like big, juicy questions and like heartbreaking beauty that was a part of being with someone as they were dying, I was going to have to probably create the space that was going to scratch the itch that I was feeling. Had gone to traditional grief support and have a therapist who's fucking awesome and has totally saved my life. And yet I knew there was another thing that I needed, which was being with people who are around my age, who'd experienced a significant loss, who could just avoid the urge to change the subject and instead make this conversation about how are we dealing with tending to our grief, like the main course of the meal, so to speak.
I love this. I love this, and I think it's a really helpful way to set the table for anybody who's joining us at the table right now in conversation. One of the things that I'm very aware of, I don't come from the United States, right? I grew up in a very different culture. I grew up in South Africa,
Yeah.
and I have come to learn how ill-equipped, as you speak of, American culture is in dealing with grief or anything that requires pause, anything that requires deep presence, anything that requires looking at the dark and looking at not just our navel in, like a navel gazing way, but really like looking inside in a way
Mm,
that is about growth and life as well.
yeah.
And one of the things I think your book does so beautifully, but I would love you to talk about here is why is that? Why is it that we live in a culture that doesn't really have the infrastructure to support people, especially young people, in grieving, right? In having the kind of infrastructure that, quite honestly, I took for granted. And
Mm,
I want to I want to come clean here because I'm going through something myself right now. So I
mm,
recently just lost my mother-in-law,
mm,
and she and I had a really tender relationship ourselves. So in addition to supporting my husband through what he's living through, I'm also dealing with my own version of what does this mean? And also, what does this mean with a toddler who just came into the world? So
mm,
asking you this question because I am living through it in real time. As a
mm,
South African, I know, it's almost like a joke. My mother and I and my sisters, in the immediate aftermath of what happened with my mother-in-law, they wanted, of course, to show up. They wanted, of course, to support both of us, but especially my husband, family. And in our culture, you show up with knives. You show up ready to peel potatoes and
mm.
vegetables and help the family get ready. The feeding part, which is such a big part of your book, that
Yeah.
is huge in our culture. We're not only feeding you during the week, getting ready for the funeral, but we know when the funeral happens, there's going to be a lot of people. So let me bring my paring knife and help you get ready right now for this feast that's about to happen. And then we have all of these other markers that happen long after the person is gone, until probably at least a year afterwards, right? And what I want to ask you, as somebody who is an immigrant in the States, I'm not in the States anymore, I'm in Mexico, so folks know. Um, but what I want to get into with you, and I think it's an important way of setting the table, is what's going on in America that makes that infrastructure, social infrastructure, cultural infrastructure, that's not there, that people feel this like listlessness.
Yep. First of all, I'm sorry to hear about your mother-in-law passing, and I'm so happy to know that in your bones there's like the paring knife instinct. I feel like so many people have that moment and they clam up or they freeze up. They feel like they don't know what to do or say or how to be helpful, and it creates all this agita when in reality, oftentimes what is most deeply needed in those initial weeks is like someone to chop and someone
Mhm.
to feed and someone to just like make sure that, you know, people are taken care of. There's like all different types of trails that you can follow sociologically, historically, culturally into why there's such constipation around this topic in the US
Good word.
and how it feels.
Great.
And I'm sure, you know, the ones that I talk about in my book that I can talk about here are like a few threads, and there are so many more threads. Some of the ones that I've looked at are around sort of the evolution of Western psychology, the predominance of Western psychology over the 20th century, and Freud, bless his heart, wrote a paper that kind of set the precedent for how grief was going to be tended to from like a Western psychological perspective. And his counsel was really like break bonds, like end the relationship. Any kind of hanging on or clinging to implies that there's something wrong with the bereaved person. And that became the essay was Mourning and Melancholia, and that became like the best practice. And what I write about in the book is that Freud later sort of redacted it in some private letters that he wrote after his daughter died. And his daughter died of the Spanish flu, which is like the, you know, the biggest flu outbreak that the world knew before 5 years ago, this week, basically. And in these letters that he wrote to a friend was like, oh gosh. No, he didn't say, oh gosh, but the sentiment was like, I miss her. I miss her deeply and dearly. And there's actually nothing wrong with that. Like, and so what has happened over time, academically and research settings, new modalities and frameworks have emerged and kind of been proven as best practice, psychologically speaking, things such as the dual process model, the idea of the importance of continuing bonds. The
Mm.
dual process model is that it's important to like lean into and kind of wade into the waters of your grief, but then step back and be able to titrate in and out. And yet Freud's sort of the TLDR of Freud's message is still sort of encoded in our cultural DNA that if you
What
are
is TLD?
trying, oh, too long didn't read, like
Okay.
the headline or the memo
My
of what
age,
Freud,
honey. Showing my age.
sorry, internet speak, it's still sort of like encoded in the in like Western psychological psyche. Um, I think another reason is that in this sort of spiritual orphan experience that is true for a lot of Americans who don't have faith-based communities to turn to.
Mhm.
There's a void that has been created. I think, you know, you think about what do you do when there's a fire? You call the fire department. What do you do when someone breaks into your house? You call the police department. Historically, culturally, when somebody dies, like you call the faith community where you live to help tend to that. And yet, with like declining attendance to church and ways in which that sort of social scaffolding of religious communities is being provided for less and less for people in America, we like don't have that third place to go to where we can tend to matters of the spirit because we've got home, we've got work, and rare, you know, less and less do we have other places where we can go where we can feel safe to connect and receive the kind of social support that we need. Like to me, the work that I'm was drawn into is I've learned over time less and less about grief and more about the crisis of isolation that we're living in. And
Mm.
that grief is just one of those moments where we most acutely feel this crisis of isolation. And, you know, where there used to be social infrastructure for people to receive support, um, folks are now experiencing a significant loss and kind of expected to be back to work in a couple days and may or may not have confidants with whom they can speak to about it and kind of have to like grin and bear it.
Mm.
And my sort of the work that I have fallen in love with is the ways in which quietly and not quietly, so many people who've experienced a significant loss are finding their ways back to care practices and rituals and reaching out for the kind of peer support that is so essential during times of loss. And the work of Renegade Grief is like, how do we flip the narrative so that becomes the mainstream conversation as opposed to the conversation that grief is something that we have to kind of grin and bear alone and get past. I'm really interested in the peer support, creative care practice story being the one that greets people first.
Mm. I love all of this. And I want to dive in a moment into some of the tools that you offer in the
Yeah.
book and also through the dinner party. But before we do, I want to call out something that I think is two things that I think are really important that you've just said. You speak about isolation, and this is not just an American problem. I think it's a global issue that we're all living with. Obviously, some cultures more than others. I recently heard Dr. Esther Perel, who's brilliant. Like she's just so fucking smart. She was talking with Oprah and she said something that landed like a ton of bricks on me. She said, because of this dialed in, this thing that we're able to do now, right? It's wonderful you and I are able to have this conversation via the Zooms and da 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 da. But we're so in our digital lives. We have 5,000 people who like a post that we put up, but we don't have anybody to come and feed the cats if something goes wrong. We
Yeah.
don't have somebody to bring that like soup, that bowl of soup. If somebody isn't even feeling well, forget what happens when the person is lost, right? That's
Yeah.
my baby in the background. And that's part of the support infrastructure that I'm speaking about,
Yeah.
that I actually have care and support and somebody who can help take care of the baby. If I need to step out, Carla, I'll let you know and I'll come back.
Yeah. I actually can't, no audio is picking up for me if there's someone's making noise in the background.
Okay, it's baby downstairs and yeah, I can hear it for sure. So that was one of the things that I wanted to pick up on and what you said. And the other thing that I really wanted to pick up on, because I think it's so brilliant that your book teases this thread out. What happens when Freud himself has come to like what the fuck moment in the nonsense that he's encouraging his patients to do, right? He's saying to his patients, like, actually, what you need to do is just get over this. This ain't nothing. He loses his own baby and he's like, stop the tracks, like stop
Yeah.
this track, stop the printer. Whatever I said, I take it back. And you have funny things that you say in your book about wanting to invite him to dinner and like basically awkwardly have him sit through, like, dude, I need you to take this back, right? And the reason why I want to go a little bit deeper here is
Yeah.
because of what it means that this influence on Western culture in particular has been so deep on severing ties with the ancestors.
Yeah.
To me, this is so important and it's in conversation with what grief looks like that is holistic, and also learning about grief from cultures that are indigenous, cultures that are Black and brown, that have almost always embraced ancestral. I mean, you can call it whatever you want, right? My ancestors, like, there's no ways I go anywhere without them. And I want to know from you, given this table that you've just set, maybe the first place to go in answering this question is to think about, it's been 15 years since your dad passed.
Yeah.
You've had some time, you've written a book, you've began a movement. Now the dinner party is something that happens across the country, United States. What I want to know is what new and fresh and important and urgent work is happening in people's hearts that is orienting ourselves around our ancestors and how we relate to them. And I'll tell you this, because I want to speak just completely honestly and like, let's call the things, right?
Yeah.
What I notice as an immigrant in the States and as a Black woman in the States is maybe in the past 5 or so years, white people have become very comfortable talking about ancestors and maybe even visiting their own ancestors, which I think is so important and healthy. And it goes towards this larger arc that is necessary, especially in the States, of healing from greater griefs, societal griefs. How do we make those things whole, right? So yeah, I'd love to hear you talk about that. And I think it's really important to also name the way in which ancestors and understanding who our ancestors are. I mean, I can sit here and tell you all kinds of stories and incidences where that has been used against me particularly, right? Like that were predominantly white, that were Western. It's a tool of oppression that has been used against us. And I'm very interested in what is happening now, that there is a healing towards that. So
Mm,
let's begin first, if you're comfortable.
yeah.
I'd love to begin just first with your own ancestors. Where are you with that?
Yeah. Cool. I didn't know our conversation would go in this direction, and I'm so happy that it is. You know, the why I love this work so much about creating a place where people can come in and essentially just create enough space in their life such that they can not scroll past a loss experience, but be in conversation with it, contemplate it, talk about it, create art about it. It's really, to me, like a moment in which we can come into right relationship with like who we are descendants of and what we are in lineage of. And by denying our grief, by ignoring it or pushing it away, we're missing this like very not abstract, but like very literal moment of like my father was here 1 minute and the next minute he's gone. Where did he go? Where did the people go that he's whose bedsides he stood next to as they died? And where will I go when someone's standing next to my own bedside as I leave? Like it takes these sort of like what can sometimes be experienced as abstract spiritual concepts and makes it like undeniably literal in the moment. And I think since my dad has passed away, it's been really interesting for me to do my own ancestral healing work, both in my relationship to him as he's kind of transitioned into ancestor in my life, and to understand like the people who he came from, my mother's family. And I actually end the book, I don't think this is a spoiler, but I end the book talking about visiting my biological mother's gravesite. My mom was adopted, and we tracked down her biological mother, and I found out I got to meet her once before she died, and I, in the last couple years, have gone to her grave and visited it, and like I write about bringing her a birthday cupcake to the graveyard and cleaning frozen dog shit off of the place where she was buried because her grave was kind of neglected. And
Uh,
it's interesting that you're asking this question because, like, at the end of this big literary exploration of like all of these different things that we can do to honor our past with the person who's gone and to be present with our grief and to create a future where the lessons from our grief are infused into it, like the book led me to a conclusion that was like cleaning dog shit off of my grandmother's grave.
right.
And just like the feeling that is like, this isn't one and done. This isn't like you grieve someone and then it completes and you move on with your life entirely. It's about this sort of like consistent maintenance that the living must do to continue hydrating the memory of the people who are no longer here. And it's been interesting to me. I did an interview recently, and the um, interviewer, who's white, was asking me about some of the rituals in the book, and we were talking about the power of altar building. And she was kind of admitting the ways in which she feels like she can't even begin to investigate what it would be like to build an altar because it feels to her appropriative, like a,
Mhm.
you
And
know,
it has been used that way for some people.
1000%. And you're like, we're talking as you're in Oaxaca, like ground zero for Day of the Dead and cultures that like are too often copycatted or ripped off. But my counsel to her was like, cool, this isn't about making a Day of the Dead altar. This is about turning into your own ancestral experience and following the breadcrumbs back to the point where every person within them has an indigenous ancestor who knew really damn well how to tend to the
Where-
bereaved, how to care for the dead. And we talked about the fact that she's Irish, and I'm like, Keening, check it out. Like every culture, every pre-capitalistic, pre-colonial culture has a history of exquisite, creative, artful, thoughtful ways of tending to the dead, spirits that have left long before. And to me, that's when my dad died and I kind of landed in sort of, early 20th, 21st century California. I was like, is this it? Like, here's this thing that's been happening to human beings for so many thousands of years. You go to the Met and you walk around, and it's like, it's basically like I mean, it's all stolen, but so much of the art at the Met are funerary objects. Like
Mhm.
humans have times of death have been times of like immense creativity and beauty and worship and praise. And like we're for whatever reason, some of which we've explored, we've landed in a time where like it's a formaldehyde body in a casket and like a platter of soggy club sandwiches, and then like you go back to work the next day.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know if how much this is answering your question, but to me, it's like all about getting this part of our body that has just sort of been like stiff and stuck and unexamined, and like getting the blood flowing
Yeah.
into it again in a way that to me is not just about tending to the one grief of the person who just died, but it's about getting a musculature in motion that every human being has that is really about how do we reckon with the fact that like this is all very, very impermanent and we are here for like a very short amount of time. And if we don't use moments of death to download that lesson, I'm afraid that like we will miss it.
Mm, mm, mm. It's beautiful and so well said. Um, yeah, I think one of the things that is also true is, yes, Americans are having a very particular experience
Yeah.
around grief and what does it mean. But if I zoom out a little bit and I look at the global, at least my globe, right? Like the places that I've been, yes, people like me are in touch with our ancestral lineage and our culture. But I will say this, we're also living in a time that our ancestors never experienced any of this shit. Like
Mm.
the
Yep.
ways in which everything is moving so fast and
Yeah.
differently, right? And the infrastructure that we have, the technology that we have, our ability to connect to one another, even if it's often superficially, it's completely different from what our ancestors went through. And so this leads me to this question, which is, yes, I think a lot of the tools speak very much to, as you said yourself, a privileged, probably, folks who come mostly from the United States. That's where the dinner party is. But
Yep.
I want to push there
Mm.
a little bit and say, I can see how so many of these tools are actually just human tools. And
Right.
that's gets me excited, right? And I want to dig into those human tools because even if you are like me and you do come from a culture that tells you, like, okay, it's time to get the paring knife, like, we know
Yep.
exactly it's time to call the mothers of prayer. That's another thing that we have. Like, people will come to your house and we kind of don't really like, we're gonna pray for you, whether you said you're part of this faith or not. Our
Yep.
prayers, because it's our heart. It's not about like we're trying to convert you. It's about something much deeper. What I
Yep.
want to ask you is, and I'm taking time to contextualize because I think it's important for whoever's listening. It's
Yep.
not only for people who don't have a church group. It's not only for people who are American and feel untethered from their ancestors.
Yep.
Really, the tools that you're describing, they're human tools, right? They're this, and actually, Carla, the funny story is looking at some of those tools. There are also, and I don't mean this in any kind of way except for a place of love, like they're animalistic tools. And
Oh
they're
yeah.
animalistic because they go to the animal being inside of us, but also animals do this. Elephants do this. Elephants know how to mark an altar, believe it or not.
I
So
believe it.
talk to me about
Yep.
specifically you, because, I think people really can understand when it's one person's experience. Talk to me about the tools that were useful for you in grieving and ongoing, in honoring your father, in living with his memory and what he means. What does it mean to take those ancestral tools and make them your? What does that look like?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, the book is a couple dozen, 2 dozen chapters that within each chapter it's an exploration of a different care practice. Maybe you would call it a ritual that has specific connotations in certain places. And basically it's like things that I personally found helpful that I have fumbled my way into or experimented with and in each of the chapters, I'm talking a little bit about my, how I got there myself, but oriented quickly after on other people that I met along the way who taught me about alternate ways of looking at that care practice because they did it in some amazing, cool, different oblique way, or science or anthropological content that sort of like helped me understand, to your point, the longing that I was having wasn't just a me thing or like an America thing or a 21st century thing. It was like a human being grappling with mortality thing. And I love those parts of culture where you can kind of zoom out and see the patterns, see both like the incredible, exquisite multiplicity of difference in every place with its riff and sometimes with opposite, but like there being these consistent patterns and themes. So that was all kind of talking obliquely. I'll talk directly now about things that have been helpful for me. Um, I write in the book about like the importance of expressing your story and finding places where you can, whether it's through words or through image or through verbal storytelling, figure out how you're going to narrate your story of loss. I write about altar building, letter writing. There's a whole chapter on the power of destruction and how when like our lives feel like something has been broken, instead of trying to like collect the pieces and seam them back together, sometimes it can feel most powerful to break back. I read about the importance of reckoning with a feeling of home when the person who died, chances was, could have been the place where you felt home. Um, and one of my favorite sections is around the importance of activism. And so often people find themselves in the wake of a loss experience, having come close to some sort of wrong in the world or some sort of injustice in the world or something that could use tending to or fixing, and how, oftentimes we think about grief as a sort of pastel colored mental health cliche, but in reality, it can be this incredible jet fuel for action and
Mm.
change and
Oh, great.
policy and finding like a real sense of purpose. And really at the root of pretty much every movement, you can find a story of grief. So, and then to your point about animals, I have a dog who's sleeping on the floor over here, and she became sort of like one of my most powerful personal grief care practices was interspecies relationships. And I write in the book about kind of some of the really interesting work that's been done around studying how animals grieve, and they don't
Mm.
all,
Mm.
as far as we know. And yet there's incredible research that to me helped the part of me that was like, I don't know, is this just all in my head? Is it
Right.
really that bad? Like, there's something about reading stories of elephants, giraffes, dogs doing this mammalian thing, which is grieving, that gave me permission to just like not second guess myself. So I feel like that was kind of a loose smattering of some of the things in the book, but the thing I'll end with saying is that the work of Renegade Grief becomes not like, oh, here's my go-to care practice and it's going to work every death anniversary for the next 50 years, but it's about coming into relationship with yourself in a way where you can check in and experiment and flex, and like we are always changing, our grief is always changing, our relationship to the person who's gone is always changing, even if they haven't changed at all. So the practice really becomes like, how do we be in clear conversation with ourselves? How do we find peers, friends who can be companions with us as we navigate the shifting landscape of our life, and find the care practice that is like right for us given where we are on any given day.
Beautiful. I want to go back to the very top of what you said when you were listing different tools that have been useful for you. You speak
Yeah.
about story and you speak about storytelling, both about the person who has passed and also what you're going through. I want to tease that out because I know for a lot of people, and especially if you live in a culture or in a place, and you don't even have to live in a culture that's hostile towards talking about things that are difficult like grief, you could just not know what to say.
Mm.
I think you started making an example of somebody who is expected to just go immediately back to work. And you are so broken on the inside. You're so brittle. And here you are, you're expected to just carry on business as usual. I really would love to hear for you, for people that are at the dinner party, other people that you've been around, what are some of the tools that people use to bring others? And it's also this thing of what you said, this is it's jet fuel. I love that word. This is jet fuel potentially, if you're willing to see it that way, right? And it could be jet fuel towards connection. I'm not saying with every coworker, when you go back to work, now suddenly we're going to have the deepest conversation and relationship. But I am pointing out there's so many missed opportunities where we're not able to show up in our full presence because we're intimidated by what might come out of our mouths. How are you? Oh, I'm just fine. Like I'm not even gonna, and I see it unfolding in real time, right? I told you I'm going through something very particular. There's a huge family loss. People ask all the time, how are you? And people who don't know me, I'm fine. Because do I really want to entertain the 500 things that I'll tell you a story on a side, and it kind of helps illustrate this. Once I was at the doctor's in Iowa, and I shared with this woman that my father passed when I was really young. My father passed when I was 9, and it was suicide related. And this woman, who's a doctor, I'm in her office. She's supposed to be administering to me. I ended up having to counsel her, right? Through, oh, it's fine. It's fine. I'm so sorry. Like, I didn't say I'm so sorry, but just walking her through this discomfort that she clearly was going through. And
Exactly.
what I'm asking is the tools that you have come across, that you use, that you know, that are about storytelling when it makes sense to, because not every time is the time to be doing this, to be more whole in how you show up.
Hmm. That anecdote you shared is such a common story, and I feel like that's part of the vicious cycle of the sort of conspiracy of silence, at least in American culture, around grief and death, and the like when you do share that someone dies, oftentimes you end up comforting the person who you've told as they kind of stumble over what to say. And I have learned that actually I don't want to have to do that emotional labor with my Uber driver or with my gynecologist while like my feet are in the stirrups. Sometimes I'm just like and there's power in that, in reclaiming that agency of like, I think that I'm so against the sort of the share or die spaces of like you have to talk about your full story and get really vulnerable. No, actually, like the conditions have to be right to feel comfortable for it to be worth the energy that you might expend to go there. One secret sauce question that we've built into the dinner party format over the years, the dinner parties basically being story sharing circles over meals for people to talk about their loss experience. We've asked everyone who attends a dinner, the hosts that we train who are volunteers, to kick off the conversations with like your name, who brings you to the table, who is it that died that makes you come here today. And then the question that we add is always, where are you at with your loss right now? And something powerful happens when you invite people to shift out of the kind of, I can replay the day that they died and the accident and the diagnosis, and we all have sort of the rehearsed version of reality that we've practiced saying, but something really poignant and presencing happens when you're like, but where is my grief today? I'm like, oh, it's in the argument I got in with my sibling and the fact that like I can't call my dad, who was always the one that kind of helped us smooth things over, or, it's present in the fact that like my stepmom, my dad's widow, has a new boyfriend and like we love him and like shout out Randall, and also like, oh, things are changing, that she's starting to get rid of more of my dad's belongings as she should, but also like, ooh, that's I feel energy to talk about that because it's not like a rehearsed past tense story, but it's like how I am actually relating in the world right now. And the research that we've done around the dinner party with a social scientist named Laura Brady, shout out her too. What's happening that's powerful is not that people are getting like a 12 steps to move through to 12 boxes to check to conclude your grief. the thing that people are moved by is the normalization that happens when you hear somebody saying the thing out loud that you have thought a million times in your head but haven't ever heard another human being express. Or when you're expressing something about your experience and watch, like you're doing right now, somebody nodding, being like, huh, I got that. I know that. And the normalization that happens allows like all of the social anxiety that we feel that we're being too much or doing it wrong or we're fucked up somehow. It actually like allows all of that to settle to the point where we can actually be present with like, okay, but what is it really like in this moment in my life? And sometimes it's like maybe it's not as bad as all of the tension that I feel in navigating these social dynamics is like leading me to believe that it might be. And maybe it's like way worse. I'm actually allowing myself to be present to the fact that like I'm angry or this is terrible or whatever your version of reality might be. So yeah, there's something about creating spaces where people feel comfortable sharing their story in a way that is like a present tense version of it with people who are listening non-judgmentally because they've been there too. That is this like such a simple technology that like unlocks something that I've watched happen hundreds of times and it's just profound. And I think people keep coming back to these dinners not because they need to rehash the story of the car accident, but because there's like this alchemy that happens when a group of people, human beings, do this thing that we have been doing for millennia, which is like gathering around the fire and the food and like talking about life and death and how do we live knowing that we will die and how do we honor the people who came before us.
I want to talk about silence.
Hmm.
Is one of the first things that you said in answer to my question, that it's okay to not share with the Uber driver. But in the book, you also talk about the participant who doesn't say anything and what it means to be present to our silence, what it means to make space for not knowing. And with that, it's also related to this other thing that you said, which is the first question we're going to ask each other and ourselves is, where am I in my grief right now? And it's such an antidote to the 7 stages of grief that most people are familiar with just because it's in the culture, right? I also was very interested to learn in the book that it wasn't even designed for the grieving. It was for people who are themselves transitioning to the next plane. So that's kind of like a huge whoa. We're
Yeah.
kind of misappropriating tools, right? But if it's helpful, that's fantastic. I would love to hear you talk about silence. And I would also love to hear you talk about what it means to be present with like that unfolding, that presence, that thing that is now, not the car crash, but what is true now. If it is the silence, if it is the I need to scream, if it is the actually I'm fine, like I'm cool. I'm actually going to plan a vacation to this person's favorite place.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that I feel like I should be silent for a second before I respond to the question. We are living in a time where silence is this fleeting, precious resource. And one of the hero characters in the book is a woman named Shay, and she's sort of the hero character of the chapter about rest. And her whole thing is like, we can only grieve if we have the space to let it kind of unfurl and to talk to it and to pull it out of hiding within us. And so much of that is about like, are we comfortable sitting in silence? Are we comfortable putting our phone charged on the other side of the room and just like staring out the window? Are we comfortable with someone when they tell us that somebody just died? And can we be okay with the silence that follows that without filling in the space immediately with consolation messages that like we may or may not authentically feel, but we're just like awkward and want to make sure that there's no silence? And like the ultimate silence, which is death itself, which is like maybe a little out there, but like that's like there's something in our avoidance of silence that also feels like our avoidance of death.
Mm.
I write in the book about on a silent retreat for 10 days over the 10-year anniversary of my dad's passing and how hard that was to
Mm.
not like be able to read books and chitty chat and all the things that I love to do, but the kind of decalcification that gets to happen to our nervous system when we just like let the snow globe settle. And there's at dinners, people are welcome to, silence is heard just as much as words, and people are allowed to just kind of sit and observe. Like that's no one's expected to like rip their heart out of their chest if that's not what they're feeling. So, yeah, I love silence.
Mm.
It's like such an important tool that we have and something that I think we're losing touch with.
Mm.
Uh,
You're sitting in New York, you're in the city, fancy schmancies, cocktails are being handed out, and somebody's like, "So, what is the dinner party?"
I'm like, put another canapé in my mouth. Um,
Silence.
Silence, chewing, quiet chewing, awkward eye contact. And then the person walks away. Um, no, the dinner party is a peer support community across the United States where people in a specific age range that always, it's important to clarify, in the sort of 18 to 45 window, come to our website and
Please
find
stop.
I know, I'm on my way. I'm well on my, I can talk
Coming
about
back
that
out pretty soon.
seriously, same. But it is a community platform where people can either start a table of their own or join a pre-existing table that's either virtual or in person. And the idea is that you kind of commit to a year at least of ongoing consistent gatherings. And these gatherings happen every other month, once a month. Each table sets its own cadence. Many of the tables are themed based around a certain type of loss, whether it's, a double parent loss or loss to suicide or a certain type of affinity or identity. So there's LGBTQ tables and BIPOC tables, and you gather over dinner, often potlucks, but you know, over time, my table started to, everyone would just bring like a pint of ice cream and we'd pass out a bunch of spoons and have kind of an open space and open floor to talk about the ways in which your experience with your grief is informing or coming up within your life and what is sustaining you and nourishing you in your grief. And what it is doing is creating a sort of circle of companions, of people that you can call and text and meet up with who know your story, know it in their own way because they've experienced a loss too, and can be the sort of support network that so many of us who've experienced a significant loss are craving but can't find. So it's a beautiful thing. I feel like it's one of the honors of my life to have been one of the people who hosted the first dinner, and there have been so many more people. My co-founder, Lennon Flowers, who was our executive director for many years, has been a real champion in figuring out how do we meet the scale that this thing is demanding from us, as we have, we've always had a wait list of people wanting to join since the day we began. And yeah, and at the end of the day, it's like a very simple, very ancient human technology, which is just like, let us break out your paring knife, like let's cook, let's talk, and like where do we go from here?
Yeah, yeah. How do people, if somebody is tuning in and they're going through something, they want to sit at this table, how do I come?
You go to the internet first. The dinnerparty.org is the website, and there's all the information you need there. We're also relaunching a buddy program. We found that for some people, the idea of coordinating with a group of 10, it
Mm.
feels overwhelming. We've all had those moments where we're trying to find the date on the calendar for where 10 calendars can align. So we have a buddy program where people can apply to get hand matched to another individual who has kind of like a similar story or similar vibe or is looking for a similar type of support. But thedinnerparty.org is our website. And if you are outside of the age range, if you're under 18 or if you're over 45, we have a bunch of other resources available to folks, and as well as kind of the guidebook that we have that we train hosts on is available for free online. So yeah, it's a hub for sure, and it's been a beautiful piece of work to be a
This
part of.
Yeah, you've offered the world something really nourishing in the deepest way. Um, tell me, tell me about the book and why writing the book became urgent, because you have put out this really nourishing piece of work, right? Through the dinner party. It lives on, it's very much alive. People can join dinner parties and different tables around the country. And I just thought to myself, this is very interesting because so much of what I came across in the book also feels like live tools and live stories that are happening in real time around the dinner party. What was the impetus for you that felt like, okay, now this thing deserves to be a book too? And what was the storytelling like for you?
I outlined this book in 2012, like a couple years after we started doing dinners. Took me a long time to actually make it a real physical thing, which I've got lots of thoughts on. But the thing that blew me away was sitting down to dinner, hearing stories of other young people grappling with their own grief story, very much finding powerful care practices to help metabolize their grief. And I remember being like, "Oh my God, you thought to do that? That's so cool. Like who told you that?" Or other friends talking about like their family traditions or, people, one of the original dinner partiers started a evening once a year where she would make pasta in the way that her and her dad used to make pasta, and it became this important touchstone for her in her year. And another friend who made like a clubhouse in her backyard when her mom died using the bottles that piled up because of her dad's drinking habit and kind of
Mm,
alchemized his
mm,
drinking habit into like a space where she could spend time by herself after her mom died. And just like Lennon, I write in the book about how when Lennon moved out of the house that she lived in with her mom, where her mom died, she decided to say goodbye to the house and wrote a letter about everything that had ever happened in her childhood home and hid it under the floorboards in the attic, but on her way out. And these are all like extraordinary people, but I'm like, they're also ordinary people figuring out how to make sense of someone's passing. And so I've been sort of slowly collecting stories like those ones of what I came to learn as or refer to as renegade grief, meaning in all of those situations, nobody was given that instruction to,
mm,
no one told Lennon what you need to do now is write a letter
mm.
recounting the history of this home and put it under the floorboards. She followed her in creative intuition of like, what do I need to feel complete in this moment? And how can I, and it was a very private thing that she did. It wasn't a big to do. Um, but I'm so interested in like the ways in which people are, despite the fact that we might not live in a culture that's got a lot of grist for the mill around how to tend to our grief, that like we defy the status quo and we do it anyways, because human beings know how to do this.
Mm,
So to
mm,
me, being renegade in this context is like deviating from the status quo, which would have us just like not talk about it anymore or forget about it, and instead rely on this like amazing animalistic knowing that we have that there are things we can do to honor our ancestors, to tend to the spirits of the dead, to tend to our own spirits in the wake of somebody's passing. And I think traditionally the word renegade kind of implies more like solo Marlboro man on the hill, kind of like solo cowboy vibes.
yeah.
But to me, being renegade in the culture we live in now, that's like hyper individualistic, that is like uncomfortable with silence, that is highly socially isolated. Being renegade is like the opposite of all those things. It's renegade to actually be interdependent. It's
Mm,
renegade to allow for the moment of silence when like we don't know what to say to the person who's grieving. It's renegade to reach out for support and reach out to offer support. So, and to me, it's like more and more in the world that we're living in now, it's very clear that tending to our grief is a radical act. It's a countercultural act. I think the more that we can hold it in that regard and in that light, the more we can kind of like continue what I think is sort of a grief renaissance that we're living through right now.
I think there's twin things going on in my brain that are really interesting. And I've wanted to bring this up throughout the conversation. Grief not being something that we do only when somebody that we love has passed, We
Yeah.
all have moved through one of the most what the fuck moments in human history, right? The pandemic. And we still have not figured out collectively how to grieve, collectively how to make sense, how to mark. We're kind of just whiplashed into this next bizarre moment. And holding space for that alongside this really counter-revolutionary and renegade work of rejecting the isolation and saying, actually, the way that we get through this is together. We don't
Mm.
be human alone. Like you can't do that. To practice, then you're just Homo sapien. To be human, you need to be in community. You need to be at the table. So I would love to hear you talk about that aspect of your work. And you alluded to it at the very beginning. You spoke a little bit about the jet fuel that this work has been, because it is actually activist work, even though it seems like, oh, we're just talking about what happened to me individually, right? Having lost my dad, having lost your dad, or having lost my mother-in-law. We're actually talking about something that's so much bigger than any one individual human.
Mm. It's so true. Yeah, there's lots to say. There's I think the being around this 5 year marker of the pandemic, I'm having my own reflections around did we grieve it? The million lives lost, and
It's
more
alone.
and more. Say it again.
Just in the States, a
Just in
million.
the States. That's right. And there's this feeling of like amnesia, pandemic amnesia that I've heard people refer to that feels really true of like we don't actually want to talk about it or revisit it or tend to the wounds that happened from around that time. We kind of just want to push forward. So I think there's something really radical about taking time in our own private and collective ways to like sense make. Where were we 5 years ago? How much have we changed and how our brains are wired and where our nervous systems sit, and being in a moment where like there's whispers of other flus happening in the world and how that feels now compared to how those whispers felt 5 years ago. And I think we've all been fundamentally changed by it. And it's important for us all to kind of take space to understand what that means for us individually and collectively. I've been thinking a lot about ecological grief and climate grief and
Mm-hmm.
the ways in which I've been kind of tracking that conversation in culture and did some experimentation around it about 8 years ago. And it's interesting to watch that phrase climate grief
Mm,
enter what I am seeing as more of like a mainstream
mm.
dialogue. Uh,
LA, January.
like loss of home, loss of place, loss of way of life, loss of community. Like more and more grief is not just the thing that we do when like our grandmother dies, but it's about reckoning with the wildly, rapidly changing planet that we're living on and all of the little losses that we are going to be experiencing in the years to come. I've been talking to a friend, his name's Eric Liu, about this idea of civic grief and how does grief apply to our relationship to our how we connect to the civic bodies that we live within. And I mean, there's lots to say on that front these days
Yeah,
too. Like
yeah,
loss of a sense of, democracy, loss of a
yeah.
sense of, a feeling like the checks and balances are in place and we can trust them and rely on them. But what's powerful to me about grief, it's like it's a real kind of reckoning with what is true and really looking into the face of like, okay, this isn't what I thought it was going to be,
Mm,
or this isn't here anymore for me,
mm,
or I can't rely on this in a way that I once did.
mm,
And
mm,
it gives us the space to then ask the next question, which is like, what do I do
mm.
to tend to myself, to care for my people, to care for the community that I'm in, such that I can, I don't think I'm having a good articulation of this, but like
No,
such
you.
that I can grapple with what is true and where we are instead of deny the reality that's unfolding in front of us. And I think for climate change specifically, that climate denial is like a inability to reckon with the grief and the fear that is our ultimate mother. being sick, or at least being sick of us, and getting ready to just kind of like swat us all off and be like, enough with all of you people.
I almost,
Bye. Bye.
I
Later.
almost
Get
say to
out of
him,
here. I'm ready to be an empty nester again, she says. So
she's like queuing up the grieving stages because she's like, they don't realize.
she's like, just so you know. Yeah. So it's I've wondered like, wow, I've been working in this theme for a long time now, and I've had moments of being like, okay, like when am I gonna like off ramp from the grief conversation? But the deeper that I go, the more expansive it becomes. And the more I'm realizing that this isn't just about like me learning how to live in a world where my dad is not physically present. It's about me being able to live in a world where like everyone I love will someday die, and the climate that I
Mhm.
live in will change, and I will someday die. And I think because we live in a culture that is like quick to distract from, as you mentioned, like the shadow or the darkness, it feels like the work that I'm getting to do is helping to build a cultural musculature that's like resisting that distraction.
Mm, mm,
And yeah, and I sure as shit don't have all the answers at all. Like I'm, I need the advice that is in this book just as much as the next person, because like I'm grieving in my own ways as the fires rage in LA, and as the, national changes in the US unfold and collapse all around us. And but I think what's become clear to me is that grief can no longer be kind of like a nice to have side piece. It actually is like a critical life skill, a muscle that we all have to be keeping toned right now, because it's gonna be the thing that allows us to participate, or if we're not in relationship to it, we'll just like stick our head in the grounds, and we can't afford to have any heads in the ground right now.
wow, that's beautiful. That's just so for this moment and for the grief that so many of us feel watching institutions that are supposed to girdle society be gutted, right? And watching in not just institutions but countries kind of coming apart. Yeah, I think what you're saying, I really want to call it out. The work of grief is a practice, grief is a skill, grief is something that we tend to constantly, not something that's like a nice to have for some people,
Yeah.
is huge and it's a game changer. Um, I want to ask you I want to ask you for the person who is supporting someone. I guess this is a very selfish question, so let me just ask it. In supporting someone who is going through the deepest and like most clutching elements of grief, and a personal grief and a human grief, because that's the one that feels the most seismic because we understand how to wrap our heads around it. How do you have a chapter about becoming a grief ally? What tools do you offer people that are, how do I show up for somebody that I love in a way that is authentic to who they are, right? Because I'm not trying to put something on them that they aren't, but also in a way, and this is where I think the tension point often comes for people, in a way that really communicates, like, I really want to fucking be here for you. And sometimes the person will come back and say, don't come. I don't want you here right now. And that can be taken as like, oh my God, like, but I really want to, I'm just going to get on the plane. So how do you help people be present given the the wilderness that somebody who's in it is going through?
Yep. I mean, I want to hear your own, what's been helpful for you and your experience, but I think some of the principles that I now remind myself of when I have a friend who's experiencing a loss, and I do my best, but I totally drop the ball sometimes too, plenty of times. To me, it's a question of recognizing the long tail. Oftentimes,
Mm.
not all of the support rushes in within like the 48 hours,
Yes.
72 hours, 1 week, 2 week, 1 month after. Put the calendar invite reminder for yourself to check in like every month, every 6 months, every year. Like be with them in what is going to be the longer unfolding journey of this work. I often hear from people this sort of fear that they're gonna, like, what is the right gift to give?
Mhm.
Or like, what is the right action to take? And I always ask, like, well, what do they like? Like, what are they into? Like, do you know them, you love them, you care for them, like calibrate into what their desires and preferences and needs are and offer something concrete and specific that is like thoughtful and custom to their world, instead of the generic fruit basket. It's like, no, your friend needs for you to babysit so that she can
Mhm.
like go help clean out her mom's house, or like, no, your friend needs you to come over and do loads of laundry or feed the cat, or they love that Thai restaurant, get them a DoorDash gift card so they don't have to cook tonight. Like it's a chance to kind of show your intimacy with the person and
Mhm.
understand how you are seeing them and the ways in which you might fill some of the gaps. And then the third thing, which is so important and so hard, is to have no expectations about the way in which they're going to receive or not receive your offer for help, which is so hard because you're like, I love you and it's so
I'm
important to
so
me.
bad at that. I'll just admit that's the part that I fail all day because I'm like, but I love you.
But I offered to fly out and you don't want me there. Like, and then we become the people where they're comforting us
Yes,
because like our feelings
yes.
are hurt because, So that's like the Jedi shit. That's like I'm gonna give you these options, these ways that I know are not self-serving, but are serving you because I intimately know you. And I'm not just gonna offer them in the first week or 2 weeks, but like in the long road. And if you say like I'm good, I'm gonna be okay with that. Or I'm gonna find a way to still send you a little love, but like do it in a way that is, not about my ego,
Mm.
wanting to win the like I'm the best friend ever award or I'm the best wife ever. Um,
I am the best wife, just so we have that on record,
I
okay?
mean, I would definitely think you were like nominated for the top five, top three for sure. Um, yeah, it's hard. And then yeah, I think that the like look at the LA fires, for example. I think someone was passing a really interesting graph around the internet of this sort of the honeymoon period after a tragedy, which feels weird to have those two words in the same phrase, but like there's this moment of like intense collective help, assistance, love, like this sort of like weird ecstasy that we get into as a species
Yeah.
after some terrible shit goes down. And then like the next terrible thing happens and everybody's attention goes on to, the thing that Elon Musk said or this other crisis that's happening and those families won't be back in their homes for at least 18 months if ever. So
Yeah.
like what's the long road look like and how we show up for our people and knowing that like we can't do it all for everybody, but like what is the role that we can play when we have the capacity to.
Right. And in saying that, I'm so glad you said it because that is such a fundamental thing of some of the shape of griefs that we're collectively going through. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about, country change. We're talking about human change, technology showing up. All these different kinds of grief makes us feel so small often against the grief itself. And I really want to underscore the importance of what you just said, which is how the people that I love, the ways that I can show up, right? Like I can't show up into nobody else can show up intimately for you the way that I can if I know you super intimately. And sometimes we get very caught up, at least I do, in what are the big things that can be done? What are the big things that we can do? And not micro focus on this one particular human. How could I
Yeah.
just fall into this one human? And that leads to, well, one of two last questions. Let me start with this one question and then I'll ask you the final question. Um, death, as you said, is a final silencer. And in a way, right? People also speak from the other side. Like I know that. And people make their presence known very much from the other side. But it is this way in which our five senses are silenced, right? And our understanding of who we are is so much shaped by those who are gone, those who are here. And what I'm always grappling with, even in good, like, and not in a morbid way, but we're all going. There's two things I have to do. Two things. I say this all the time. I gotta stay black and I'm gonna die. Those are the two things that I'm gonna do. Okay. Everything else, like I get to
I'm
make
so
stuff.
glad you didn't say I'm going to pay taxes and I'm going
Oh,
to
girl,
die.
no, 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 no,
Yeah.
no. The two things that are a must. I will
Yep.
be black. That's just a fact of my life, a beautiful one. And I will, my beautiful black booty is gonna be in the ground one day, right? And I want to know from you, what does it mean to live with that knowledge?
Mm. I think there's a little bit of a less of a tolerance for bullshit
Mm,
that
mm,
happens when you're like, okay,
mm,
this is not how I want to. I now know very literally how temporary my time is, and like I do not want to spend my time on Earth
mm.
doing fill in the blank, whatever bullshit is to you at that particular moment
Yeah.
in time. You enter this club. I refer to it in the book as like a cosmic motorcycle club. I don't know if that's your thing or not, but that's why I kept seeing it. And it's like this club of people who like know the preciousness of life, not because it's like some twee, cutesy Hallmark card thing, but because we can't ever see its opposite. Like
Mm,
we know for certain that our time here is fragile and limited because we've looked it in the face or we have the empty chair around the table. And I'm so not like a silver linings person, but there is some sort of superpower that gives
mhm,
you, where
mhm,
suddenly you're like, okay, I'm not here to play.
mhm.
Unless like you're here to play and that's your purpose. And that's,
Mhm.
I
But
love that for you.
that's a different kind of play. That's an
Different kind of
intentional,
play.
yeah, yeah.
So, and that doesn't always happen for everybody, but to me, the spirit of renegade grief is like, let's not quickly laminate over the thing that just happened and pretend like everything's fine and pretend like we can just go back to work and like it's okay. Because if you skate over that, you miss the moment that's the lock in of like, oh, okay,
Mhm.
got it. This is
Mhm.
temporary. This is precious. This is finite. This is fucking heartbreaking, but it's also beautiful. And like, what am I going to do with my precious life?
Mhm.
To me, the spirit of the dinner party is really about having people who hear that music, who want to hang out and be like, okay, no, but really, let's be accountability partners. How is this affecting you? How, like, what is the bullshit that you don't have time for anymore because this happened? How are other family dynamics impacting you in such a way that you need space and companionship to figure out how to, like, shift out of that gear? So like the motorcycle club feeling of it is such that like you have to find people who have your back and
Mhm.
whose back you can have as you navigate moving through the world in a way that's like, okay, this is it. What are we gonna do about it?
Renegade Grief by Carla Fernandez is available on March 11 in the United States and around the world, I'm guessing too. Please, please, please make sure you get a copy. I have read the advanced copy and I highly recommend it. I especially recommend it as something that is a beautiful gift to someone who's going through something, right? As an additional toolkit to whatever else resonates with them, that particular person. And Carla, to end, I'm going to ask you to give us the beginning. On purpose, we did not speak about who you are, what
Mm.
your bio looks like, all these fancinesses that are around you. And I know people can look you up and read your full bio, but what do you want somebody to know about you who has listened to this conversation and is curious about learning more about who you are?
Well, if you've made it to the end of the episode, I feel like we're old friends by now. But I'm Carla Fernandez. I am a creative community builder. I do that work through my work with the dinner party and Renegade Grief. I also do that work helping set up circles of care within other organizations. A lot of my work happens within the philanthropy space. You can read more about that on my website. And yeah, I live in upstate New York most of the year. I spend the winters normally in the Mojave Desert. I'm like a 80-year-old snowbird. I go to the Southwest for the winter in a little town called Joshua Tree.
Mm.
And I'm married to an amazing person named Ivan. And yeah, despite the fact that grief has been a major theme of my life, I feel like I'm living a very blessed one. And I feel like those two things aren't mutually exclusive.
thedinnerparty.org, is that right?
Yep. Right.
thedinnerparty.org. Highly encourage you to check it out. I also really encourage folks who are not in that age bracket. You said it's open for folks who are between the ages of
Like 18 to 45. And
yeah, it's really, really, really Renegade, fantastic, just like dope ass work that you're doing. I so appreciate it, and I love this conversation. Thank you so much. This feels like soul work.
thank you. Was so happy when you reached out, and I now wish I was in Oaxaca with you so we could go drink some mezcal and keep talking, but
Yeah.
Was that useful? You want to go even deeper? I'd love to support you. My coaching program can help you make money and spark action whenever you speak with intention. Book time to chat using the link in the description box below. Also, leave a comment if this video offered something you needed to hear today, or if you have a question you want me to unpack in next week's episode. Fresh episodes drop every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. Hit subscribe to get a notification so you never miss a beat. Thank you so much for being here. I want you to know that your story matters. And I'm here to help you stand out from the stage to the page.